Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger with our weekly dialogue with Helga Zepp LaRouche, the founder and chairman of the Schiller Institute. Today is February 24th, 2021. And Helga, there's some very interesting developments that seem small on the surface, but maybe pointing towards some major changes. Most of them are not covered in the US press, but some of this has to do with policies coming from the Biden administration, including relations with China. What can you tell us about that?
Well, it is interesting, and as you said, it's not mentioned in the Western mainstream media, but it was referred to in the Chinese media, namely that Biden, surprisingly, said in both his speech to the G7 meeting as well as to the virtual meeting of the Munich Security Conference that this is not about confrontation between East and West, that he has no intention to go back to the Cold War, that every country has the right to choose its own path. So I think, while I don't want to exaggerate this as such, one has to see it in the context of, that the relationship between the United States and China for the future of humanity is the most important strategic relations, for the simple reason that these are the two largest economies, that China is involved with Russia in a strategic alliance, and that therefore, to not have a confrontation and not continue where it was at the end of the Trump administration, which was completely governed by the China bashers of Pompeo, Navarro, and alike. So therefore, it is quite interesting that the Chinese foreign ministry immediately emphasized that Biden did not push the G7 to go into an anti-China confrontation. And Foreign Minister Wang Yi basically welcomed that and reiterated the Chinese position that China is ready for a reset of the relations between the United States and China. But then he said, what are the conditions for this to succeed? Well, first of all, that the United States must stop smearing the Communist Party, the social system of China, that the sanctions must be lifted, that the interference in the internal affairs in respect to Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and Taiwan has to stop. So obviously, these are a lot of caveats, and one has to also see, Biden is a new administration, and in the beginning, in the election campaign 2016 and throughout the earlier part of Trump's administration, he said many times that to have a good relationship with Russia and China is a good thing and not a bad thing. But then we saw how increasingly, under the strategic pressure and the pressure from the neocons and the military-industrial complex, that Trump more and more, capitulated to this line, especially in respect to China, which, after April last year, he started to blame for the COVID and, all kinds of other things. So by the end of the Trump administration, unfortunately, the relationship with Russia and China was at a historic low. So anything below the historic low can only go upward. And therefore, one can only hope that Biden would be more able than Trump to keep that line, because he has all these hawks in his administration. Blinken has a very bad record. Others come from the Obama period. And, there are also some people where some insiders, say the glass is half full. So we have to see that. I'm not making a judgment at this point. I'm just reporting objectively that there were these notices about these different emphasis in Biden's speech. And given the fact that, I mean, it was expected that his tone would be softer, also in respect to the European allies. So I'm not over evaluating that and giving it too much importance, but I think our being absolutely objective and noticing these things is also important for our viewership to see that we have this kind of evaluation. Now, one little sign that there may be a slight improvement is also the fact that it seems that a compromise concerning Nord Stream 2, the pipeline from Russia to 12 European countries, seems to go ahead. The State Department was supposed to report to Congress a new list of firms to be sanctioned, and the only list they transmitted was 18, the ones who already have been sanctioned in the past and either left the whole deal or are in the process of leaving. So the damage would be not too big. So it seems that the ongoing construction of the pipeline is going ahead. Now, that has to be seen also, because this is not the evening yet of the day, but also judging from reactions from other people like Ted Cruz and some other Republicans going absolutely crazy by saying this is a terrible disaster for US national security, which it for sure is not. And it is a question of the energy sovereignty of the European nations, who regard the delivery of Russian oil and gas as extremely reliable, that there was never any interruption, even in the height of the Cold War. So from a European standpoint, they have actually made the experience that these gas and oil deliveries from Russia are extremely reliable and not subject to strategic blackmail whatsoever. So I think this is another interesting sign, and one has to just hope, that going in the direction of cooperation and not mindless strategic confrontation, that path can be not only maintained, but it can be expanded to those areas where cooperation is a question of survival.
Well, perhaps Ted Cruz is sounding militant to take his people's minds off what happened in Texas with the unreliability of the energy grid there, and also his vacation to Cancun when the people of Texas were suffering. But we'll come back to Texas in a moment. There's one other area where the question of US-China relations is so important, which is the discussion about expanding the NATO presence or the Western presence in the South China Sea, Taiwan Straits. And Lyle Goldstein has been very outspoken in warning about not proceeding with this. What's the latest from him?
Well, he is obviously an important minority voice from the US naval. I mean, he's a scholar there. And he basically said that the present or the previous Indo-strategic, Indo-Pacific strategy of the United States is fraught with absolute dangers. And he basically denounced the fact that the Trump administration released all these documents, all these security strategy documents. Normally, they are classified for 30 years, but they obviously felt that it was in the interest of them to release them. And Goldstein basically says these papers go back to the 1992 doctrine, which was Dick Cheney naturally at that time, which had the idea that the United States will never allow any other country to bypass the United States economically, politically, socially, in any way, any other country or a group of countries. And naturally, given the rise of China and the change going on in Asia in general, this is a recipe of for disaster, and therefore it is quite important that Goldstein is warning of this. And in general, let me just say, I mean, look, Trump was absolutely correct to say that he wanted to end the endless wars. It was also clear that several of his team, especially out of the State Department, they completely ignored the word of President Trump, for example, concerning the withdrawal of troops from Syria. Now there is a huge debate, what should happen with the troops in Afghanistan? Should they be withdrawn? Well, I mean, I just watched a German documentary which interviewed a lot of the German soldiers who participated in the Afghanistan war for the last 20 years. And they interviewed several people who said, when they were asked, what was the net result? Did you accomplish anything? They said, no, we did not accomplish anything. And at what a price? Of many lives being lost, not only of people in Afghanistan, but also of the NATO troops being there. And one of them said, well, we did a certain amount of good while we were there, helping Afghanistan to try to get, education and infrastructure. But now where, basically it looks that the mission is coming to an end. The Taliban are returning and ISIS is also all over the place in the country. So the net result of 20 years of war is absolutely nothing. And if you think what was done to the lives and families of many American soldiers, other soldiers from other countries, who had, 3-4 shifts to Afghanistan, Iraq, coming back with traumatic disorders, ruining the family life. I mean, this is really something, that whoever is now defining the new policy of the United States, nothing has been gained for US interest with these wars. As a matter of fact, if the money which was spent there would have been, or in all these so-called endless wars, would have spent in building up infrastructure in the United States, building a health system, it would have been so much more in the interest of the United States. And it's not too late to correct that now, because, I mean, these endless wars they cannot succeed. Afghanistan, the Soviet Union failed in Afghanistan. The endless efforts to democratize countries which are not part of our civilization and who have their completely different traditions and cultures, it should be enough. These wars should be ended. And if there would be a policy, then all the major neighbors of Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, they should work together to rebuild this region, which is completely destroyed by war, by extending the new Silk Road, by cooperating Russia, China, India, with Iran, with Egypt, with Saudi Arabia. I mean, basically the approach President Putin had taken, which then was later sabotaged, but that you have to bring all the different parties on one table. And, right now you have a terrible situation. The reports are not only that Yemen is suffering one of the worst famines on top of the pandemic. There are millions of people in danger to lose their life. The same is now reported from Syria, where 1 year of COVID is on top of the war destruction, has created a situation where millions of people are in danger of starvation. So will humanity sit by and let all of this happen, or can we not change our attitude and say, now the task is to reconstruct the world, especially Southwest Asia, by agreeing that each country should contribute that which it can, and that would be the human approach. So the Schiller Institute is campaigning for that. We want to have the new Silk Road extended to Southwest Asia, to Africa for that matter. And, let's just start a new chapter in the history of humanity.
Now, of course, we're still dealing with the pandemic in the West, and in many cases, not dealing with it too well. Where do things stand in your uh, sense of this? I mean, the EU is still a mess. The United States, there seems to be maybe some progress, but now you have the mutations. What's your reading on this, Helga?
Well, we are still in a undecided race against time, because it is now very clear that, if you leave the pandemic raging in third world countries, the danger is that new strains, new variants develop against which the existing vaccines are not efficient, and that could become, devastating. With other words, that you lose this run against time. And therefore, I think when I think it was the Mexican Foreign Minister Ebrard, who in a meeting of the UN Security Council just recently said that 10 countries have secured three-quarters of the vaccines for themselves, but that there are over 100 countries who have not received a single dose of vaccine. Then that points exactly to this foolish selfishness, which obviously, a lot has gone wrong in the United States and in the EU. There were mistakes made in the beginning, very clearly, because, rather than, what was happening well with the Trump administration was warp speed and the speed with which these vaccines were developed. I mean, Germany played a very important role in that. Russia did, China did, they all developed vaccines very, very quickly. But what was not done well was the accompanying measures. For example, Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the EU Commission, did not order enough vaccines. So now you have a situation where Germany, where the the one of the really most important vaccines was developed first together with Pfizer, uh, they are only on place 30 in terms of the vaccines. I think only 4% of the people have been vaccinated so far, as compared to over 50% in Israel, the United Arab Emirates, even Serbia has already 3 vaccines, being much ahead. So you can actually see that the cost efficiency thinking, which was portrayed by the EU, is causing people to lose their lives. They go from one step to the next. They didn't use the summer pause to prepare for the second wave. Now they have vaccination centers, but no vaccine. It's a complete bungling, and naturally nothing was repaired from the standpoint of getting rid of the privatization of the health system, because that is really the crux of the matter. Because medical care should not be subject of the private sector, but it should be something which should be taken care by the state. So there are some countries who are putting the common good up front much more. A good example of that is the visit of the Argentine president Fernandez, who just visited Obrador in Mexico, and they basically said that they are cooperating in the development of vaccines, but also in general for the unity of all of Latin America, and that gives the continent a future. They also thanked Putin and Lavrov and the Russian ambassador to Mexico of having, helped them to get larger agreements with Russia for the Sputnik 5 vaccines. But it is still not resolved for the general. And there was a meeting of the Atlantic Council where the head of the African Center for Disease and Control, Dr. John Skengo Song, I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, but he said, where will humanity go if the Africans don't get vaccinated? And that is really the big challenge, because people have to understand that this pandemic and other pandemics will be only conquered if you bring the development to all countries. And that is why the initial response of the Schiller Institute to build a modern health system in every single country is the only way we get out of this, and that has to be put up on the agenda. And that is the big moral challenge for all of humanity.
Now, you mentioned the problem of privatization with healthcare. We see the same thing with the breakdown of the electricity grid in Texas, where on the one hand, you had the failure of the sustainable or renewable resources with wind power, solar, and so on. But what's even discussed less is the role that deregulation played in the cost cutting, the austerity, the failure to repair or upgrade the system, which was part of the story also. Now, with the Great Reset and the Green New Deal pushing ahead, what is the real lesson from Texas?
Well, we had in this report, which I can only encourage our viewers to get a copy of, we had warned that if you go in the direction of a Green New Deal, a Green Deal as in Europe, that you go out of nuclear, you go out of fossil fuels, that you are risking blackouts, and blackouts can be deadly. I think what we have seen in Texas and 14 other US states, blackouts or almost blackouts and rolling blackouts. For example, Louisiana, 1 week after, is still 1/4 of the people are still without water. You have a situation where, unless you have a real investment program in the modernization of infrastructure, this can happen any moment again, because some of these electricity grids are over 100 years old. Other infrastructure components are 50, 60 years old, which is about the lifespan of most infrastructure elements. So, it really shows you that the profit orientation only for things which belong to the common good and the welfare of the population should not be in the private hand, or else you will have exactly these results. Now, if the Great Reset would be implemented on a large scale in Europe and the United States, it would be the end of these countries as industrial nations. And as we have discussed earlier, given the fact that Russia, China, and other Asian countries are not going in this direction because they bet on nuclear energy, on crash programs for fusion energy. Therefore, if the so-called West collapses and these other countries are rising, this is the certain prescription for World War III, because I do not think that the NATO countries would give up as peacefully as the Soviet Union did in 91. So I think, also, if you look at it, I think there is a growing awareness that this is not functioning. For example, the effort by the EU Commission to impose this crazy taxonomy, which is that every firm must give their CO2 footprint, register it, and then be, get credit or not credit according to how your CO2 footprint says. There is no progress. There are about 10 countries which absolutely do not produce the data. There's also a renewed discussion that some of these countries say that you cannot solve this problem without massive investment in nuclear energy. So there is a total turmoil, but I think the lesson to be learned from Texas, that this Great Reset should stop, because all it will do is spend 30 to 50 trillion dollars in, basically liquidity pumped into the system, which would go in the hands of the speculators, make the rich more rich, and destroy the absolute living condition for the majority of the population, who would get more poor. Energy prices would rise, other prices would rise, and it would lead to a social explosion. So I think we should take the Texas development as a big warning, and message by St. Peter to not go in this direction.
And as we're seeing people freeze to death in Texas, one of the richest states in the United States, we're also seeing, because they're going back into these backward technologies, we're also seeing the future with the 3 Mars missions, which you've been speaking of quite a bit, but this is still the inspiration for the future.
Yes, I think this is really very exciting uh, because yesterday I listened to a radio program, and they had an audio where they played some beautiful wind from Mars. Now this is the first time that Earthlings could listen to the weather on Mars, and I think this is very exciting, and everybody is looking for life, traces of life. The UAE orbiter, is circling around the Mars, trying to study the weather patterns. The Chinese rover and lander, basically, they are on Mars. Uh, and oh no, they have not landed. It's the US Perseverance, which is on Mars. And there you have now, for the first time, pictures taken from the helicopter. They are looking for traces of life. And the Chinese, they are now in the orbit, and they will land probably in May, also on a mission to find underground water. So I listened also to a program with the former German astronaut Ulrich Walter, um, who is now a professor for space research in Munich. And he said, this is exciting for everybody, because the big question, which excited philosophers and thinkers since thousands of years, is there other life other than us Earthlings on Earth somewhere in the universe? And by looking even for the tiniest relicts of microbes and even smaller smaller organisms, you can find traces. Was there ever some form of life, or what shape of life was existing on Mars, which gives you a clue about the potentials in our incredibly vast universe? And I'm so excited about a video which was made by the head of the UAE space program, who is also a minister in the government there, a 34-year-old woman with the name of Sarah Al-Amiri. And she made a video, or she had a video from 2017, where she talked about how the United Arab Emirates decided on a Mars mission only 6 years ago. This now naturally is a little bit longer, but that they decided it because it would allow them to leapfrog into the forefront of science and space research. And then she said at one point in the program, she said that she always asks people to stick their finger up and then look, at the sky at the top of their finger, and looking at the picture made by Hubble of a small part of the sky. And then you would see billions and billions, not of stars and planets, but of galaxies. And these have thousands and billions of stars in them. So she said, if people get that idea, how incredibly big the universe is, you get a completely different perspective of who is mankind in the universe. And that has been an image which motivated me for a very long time, because just the idea, that we have to understand what is the universe in which we are and of which we are a part. This brings up the most exciting questions. That we are not in a bound system, we are not in a fixed Earth with fixed resources, but that we are just at the beginning, of really developing a completely different idea about the relationship of man, his ideas or her ideas, and the universe. And once you start to think that way, you are out of the green uh, ideology, and you are starting to think big, and you're starting to think human.
Well, in Texas, they used to think big, and in fact, NASA is based there. So maybe this warning will cause people to then look to the UAE and see what's possible. I would urge people to go to the larouchepub.com and order your copy of The Great Leap Backward, our report on the Green New Deal and the Great Reset, so that you can see who it is that's trying to stop progress and join with us, join the Schiller Institute to become part of the solution. So Helga, that's I think the unless you have something else, that's all I have for today.
Well, all I want to say is, Houston, we have a problem and let's fix it.
Okay, very good. All right, I'll see you next week, Helga.
Till next week.